So we're going to take a look at the urinary system models. There are three main models that show you the different anatomical structures of the urinary system. And just remember that with the urinary system, it is deceivingly simple. And what that means is it looks like from the outside it's very simple, and then as we kind of zoom into it and get to those microscopic structures, we find that it is quite complex. Okay, so why don't we start with maybe some of the simpler models, and then we'll work our way forward from there. So this one here is the male and female reproductive / urinary model, even blood vessels. It has structures associated with male and female reproductive system, which we'll be getting to, but we're going to focus on it right now in terms of the urinary system. And what we can see is a macroscopic view of the urinary system, again, relatively simple, with our two kidneys, the ureters that are coming down from them, that drain them, that then take it down to the bladder. And the bladder that we see down here, and we see a representative male bladder. How do I know it's male? That's because some of the accessory organs of the reproductive system are seen near the bladder, including the prostate gland and the seminal vesicles and the ejaculatory ducts. So those kind of weird smiley face looking structures, almost makes the bladder look like some sort of smiley face. Those are only in the male reproductive system, so we know that this is going to be a male bladder. But we can see the two ureters that are coming down to the bladder, draining the urine to the bladder from the kidneys, and then there's going to be one urethra that's going to drain the bladder to the outside. And in the female, it's going to be a relatively short structure. In the male, because it goes through the penis, it's going to be a relatively long structure with three different segments. So in the male urethra, you need to know all three segments, starting out with a prostatic urethra, because the urethra that we can see right through here actually passes through the prostate, because this is a shared tube, shared between the urinary system and the reproductive system. So during ejaculation, prostatic secretions are going to enter into the urethra, but during urination, the bladder is going to be drained through that same tube. So it's going to go through the prostatic urethra. There's a small section right after that's called the membranous urethra that you can really best see only on the, not the cadaver, that would be a little bit tough, but the torso model section of the reproductive system and urinary system. So it starts out with prostatic urethra. There's a small section which is the membranous urethra, and then it goes into the penile or spongy urethra. So three sections in the male. While we have this open, we can look at the bladder itself. So again, that's one of our best views of the bladder. And we can see that inside of the bladder, we have those wrinkles that are called rugae, just like we saw in the stomach. And remember that the bladder is going to be lined by transitional epithelium, so when it fills, it's going to expand, and when it is empty or empties, it's going to kind of have this elastic property to it where it's going to go back to a somewhat original size. So that's why we see all these wrinkles in here as it's kind of shrunk down. You can also see that there is a finely detailed layer of muscle, and this is called the detrusor muscle. The detrusor muscle are the smooth muscles that will constrict and squeeze the bladder like squeezing a sponge to get the fluid out. The other thing that we can see if we look in this side of it is you can see that there's a triangularly shaped area inside of the bladder. So it goes from the two points, the two entry points of the ureters to the exit point for the urethra. So this triangular area that we see right here inside of the bladder is called the trigone. Okay, so that shows us again a macroscopic view of the organs of the urinary system. When we look at the kidneys as well, of course we have a renal artery and a renal vein. We know that from before. And when we look into the kidneys, we can see that there are different regions of the kidney. I'm going to shift this down a little bit. It's going to be helpful. So we can see that there is a renal capsule, which is on the outside here, superficial. And then there's going to be a cortex and the medulla. And the cortex, like when we learned the brain, right, the cerebral cortex, that was towards the superficial layer of the brain and the superficial layer of the kidney. So we have a a renal capsule on the outside, which is connective tissue. Then we have this cortex, which is out here. And then all of this area that we see in here is called the medulla. So that's the deeper area. In here, what we have is called the renal pelvis. And then, again, draining from the renal pelvis, which is where all the urine is going to collect, we have the ureter. So we have two ureters that go from each of the two kidneys down to the bladder, and one urethra that then drains the bladder. So that's about as much detail that we can see inside of the kidney on this model and that you would be expected to know. If we wanted to see more detail, we would want to go to one of our other models. And we will, but prior to that, I'm going to show you our other model, which is the male urinary system model. And that one is coming. It's here. So there's the top of it. I'm zoomed in for some detail. And then there's the inferior portion of it. And we can actually see the symphysis pubis there and the pubic bones, etc. And here's the bladder right there. Okay, so when we look at this one, again, we can see similar structures. We can see the renal capsule. Again, renal means kidney. We see this little indented area here where the ureters are coming out and the renal artery and the renal vein are entering and exiting. This is called the hilum or hilus. So that indented area, just like we had in the respiratory system when we looked at the lungs where we had those indented areas, same type of thing. So this is called the hilum or hilus that we see here. Besides that, when we go down here to the bladder, we can see some of those superficial structures of the bladder. So looking at the posterior side here, we know this is male because, again, we can see the prostate gland and the seminal vesicles and the ejaculatory ducts. We can see those ureters coming in. We can see this wrinkled layer here, which is the detrusor muscle, again, the smooth muscle that helps us to drain the bladder. And then when we look inside, we can see the wrinkled rugae, we can see the triangular trigon, and we can see that prostatic urethra right there passing through the prostate inferior to the bladder. So that's about what you would see on this model. The interior of the kidneys on this model, they take a little artistic liberty, which is not entirely accurate anatomically. So I would stay away from looking at the inside of the kidney there. But what you can look at for the internal anatomy of the kidney is this model. This is the three-part model. 1, 2, and then it stops. The third part is over to the right, and it's another zoomed up area of the kidney. There is also a model that looks like this from the same manufacturer that is called, lovingly, the kidney on a stick model. It's kind of like a state fair or something like that, right? Deep fried, walk around. But in any case, there is another model that looks just like this view of the kidney that shows almost the same exact structure. So if you see pictures of that, everything that we're going on this first part of the three-part model will look the same on that kidney on a stick model. But again, we have renal capsule on the outside. There is that ureter. There is that pelvis. So if we start from the outside, we look at those regions, renal capsule, then renal cortex is all of this, renal medulla is going to be all of this region, and then we get into the deeper areas where the pelvis is, as well as these little branches leading to the pelvis. This model, as well as the other one, does a good job of showing the vascularization of the kidney. It is well vascularized. It receives much more blood than a lot of other organs because the kidney has a role on conditioning the blood, right? So it's going to help control the concentration of the blood, the volume of the blood, exactly what molecules and ions are going to be retained or removed from the blood, etc. So we have to have a lot of blood flow to it. And we know we have that renal artery and renal vein, but after that, notice that it branches. And just like when we were looking at blood vessels before, if it branches or if it moves into a new area, it gets a new name, okay? So when we see it branching here, these are called segmental arteries. They are going out, and notice that we have these triangular structures here. These are called pyramids. They're found in the medulla of the kidney. Now these are called pyramids, but at one time they were also called lobes. And so this section of blood vessel that goes between these pyramids or between these lobes is called the interlobar artery and vein, right? Inter means between, and then lobar, between the lobes. So after that we have the interlobar, then notice it curves. Right as we get to the border between the medulla region and the cortex region, it curves like it's afraid to go into that cortex. This, as it's making an arc, is called the arcuate artery and vein. Right? So this is the arcuate artery and vein. From there, you can see how there are extensions that do go into the cortex. These have a couple different names. We can call these cortical radiate arteries and veins because they are radiating like rays of the sun into the cortex. We only have one sun, but you know. So you can call them cortical radiate artery and vein, or once upon a time, these areas of the cortex were called lobules, right? So a big region was called a lobe, and a smaller region was called a lobule. These were called interlobar artery and vein, and these, the other name for these would be interlobular artery and vein. So it's shorter than cortical radiate, but you know, it can be a little bit confusing as well between interlobar and interlobular. So it's up to you in terms of which one you want to learn for the name of these vessels. Now from there, notice that we have small branches and small little balls out here. The detail is not seen very well once we get that small on this model. So if we were going to go any further in terms of the detail of the blood vessels as well as these renal corpuscles that are out here, we would then shift to the next part of the model where it's zoomed up. But before we do that, I do want to review a few larger structures of the kidney that we can see well here. We can see some represented nephrons, the functional unit of the kidney, but again, any more detail than just saying, oh, that's a nephron, we would move to that model, or at least that zoom part of the model. But remember that these are called pyramids or lobes, and then in between, you can see how there is some tissue that's in between these lobes, where those interlobar vessels are going through. Those are called the renal columns. So it's a column of tissue that occurs between the pyramids. So that is called a renal column. In addition, we have the renal sinuses. Again, renal means kidney. So sinus is going to be a space like we learned with bones. And so these spaces that we see in here, where we have the segmental vessels going through, these are called the renal sinuses in there. The last thing that I wanted to point out on this one is that we know that this area where all the urine gathers is called the renal pelvis, but that there are these branches that are leading to it. These are called calyces. An individual one is called a calyx, C-A-L-Y-X, but it's calyces, and you get rid of the X when we're talking plural. So each one of these smaller ones here are called a minor calyx. Together they'd be minor calyces, but this is a minor calyx, and it acts as a funnel to collect all of the urine that's being produced in the nephrons from this region, from this lobe, if you will, and it collects here into that minor calyx. So this one is collecting from this area, this one is collecting from this area, etc. So these are all minor calyces that are gathering urine from the nephrons that are out here. Then notice that these minor calyces will come together and form another larger one that would be called a major calyx. So two minors come together, two or more minors come together and form a major calyx. So like this would be a minor, this would be a minor, and where they come together right in here, that would be a major. And then the major calyces all drain into the renal pelvis. Okay? All right, so let's shift to the zoomed in area. What we're going to do is we're going to zoom in on an area like this, where it shows the overlying cortex, it shows our pyramid, and we're going to look at the structures there. So for shift, shift. There we go. Okay? So again, we've zoomed up. Now, renal capsule, renal cortex as a region, renal medulla as a region. This structure, triangular shaped structure right here, where it's darker, is called the renal pyramid. All right, so let's look at those blood vessels again. This is a blood vessel. This red one here is a blood vessel that's going between two pyramids or two different lobes. So that's interlobar artery and interlobar vein. Remember, then it makes an arc between the medulla and the cortex. So this is the arcuate artery and vein. Then as it radiates out into the cortex, we have cortical radiate artery and vein, or interlobular artery and vein. Okay? But now we can see that these interlobular arteries and veins have branches off of them. And these branches that are coming off and going into this ball of capillaries that is called the glomerulus is called the afferent arteriole. We're going from artery down to arterial, just like we learned before. So we have the interlobular artery and then the afferent arteriole leading into the glomerulus. Now notice afferent is going in like we learned with nervous system, right? Like afferent neurons coming in, and then an efferent arteriole goes out. So there's an afferent that comes off of the interlobular artery. There's an afferent that one goes into that ball of capillaries called the nephron. I'm sorry, not the nephron, but the glomerular capillaries, the glomerulus, and then there's an efferent arteriole that comes out. The efferent arteriole then goes into this set of vessels here. This is called a peritubular capillary bed. Notice it changes from red to blue like that. Okay, so that really shows us all the detail of the smaller blood vessels that we can see on this particular section. And oftentimes when you're learning the blood vessels, it's good to think of a tracing of the flow of blood into the kidney through all these vessels and then out again. And so we would get to, again, these smaller vessels, these different types of capillaries out here, and then it switches to veins, and we work our way out of the kidney again. We also see a second capillary bed right here. See, again, it changes from red to blue, very small vessels. This here is a separate set of capillaries. It's called the vasa recta. Vasa like vessel, and recta like rectus means straight. So these are straight vessels that lead down to a capillary bed down here in the medulla. Now these capillaries, like we learned in the cardiovascular system before, are all about exchange, exchanging with the surrounding tissues and cells. So we see that happening with oxygen, that's why it's changing color. But here it's also going to be water and different types of ions and molecules that we're exchanging with the fluids that will become urine inside of these tubules that we see here. Okay, so let's switch over from blood vessels to the more detailed structure of the tubular system, including the nephron. So remember, the nephron is the structural and functional unit of the kidney. We see two example ones here. These structures are all making up a nephron. This one, which extends only a little bit down into the medulla, is called a cortical nephron because it's mostly in the cortex. This one, which extends way down in the medulla, is called a juxtamedullary nephron because it extends, again, way down into the medulla. So there's two types of nephrons that occur in the kidney, and in lecture we can talk about why there's two different types. But when we're looking at the structure of them, this is where the filtration, where we're pulling fluids out of the blood, it occurs right here at the glomerulus or glomerular capillaries. So like a coffee filter, right, it's passing through, small materials are passing through the filter, and large materials are being retained within the cardiovascular system, like cells and large molecules, etc. So the things that are dropping out, like water and small molecules and ions, are being collected in this cup that we see here, which is called the glomerular capsule. Don't mix that up with the renal capsule. Renal means kidney. That's this big one out here. This is the glomerular capsule that surrounds the glomerulus. So glomerular capsule catches that filtrate, and then that fluid that has been filtered out of the blood makes its journey into the proximal convoluted tubule that we see here. Proximal because it's close to where we started, and then convoluted because it's all windy like that and wavy. Proximal convoluted tubule. Then this whole structure here is called the loop of Henle or the nephron loop. We have a descending limb of the loop going down and an ascending limb of the loop coming back up. So it comes into the cortex. Notice it gets all windy and curvy again. This is the distal convoluted tubule. And notice the distal convoluted tubule from multiple nephrons dump into this large tree-like structure here, which is called the collecting tubule. So each of these branches that we see there are collecting filtrate or fluid, which will ultimately become urine from these different nephrons. And you can see routing it down here into the medulla through the pyramid, and down here is where that urine will be released into the waiting, if you will, kind of cup-like or more funnel-like structure that we call the minor calyx. Okay? So the urine production occurs here, mostly in the cortex, but a little bit into the medulla with these nephrons. One other term before we move from this zoom to the last one is that there is a term called renal corpuscle, and a renal corpuscle is the glomerulus plus the glomerular capsule. Those two structures equal the renal corpuscle. Okay? So when we see these ball-like structures out here and we can't tell, okay, are we pointing to the glomerulus in the inside or are we pointing to the capsule on the outside? Collectively, what we're calling that is the renal corpuscle. And that leads us to the last section of this model, which is a zoomed up version of the renal corpuscle. Sorry, there's a little angle on it there. But this is one renal corpuscle. So what we're seeing here is, here's the glomerulus, here's the glomerular capsule. Here's the afferent arteriole bringing blood into it. The blood goes into the glomerular capillaries, and then we have filtration where small things will drop out and be collected by the capsule. Most of the fluid and most of those ions and small molecules actually continue on as well out the efferent arteriole. Notice that the afferent arteriole has a bigger diameter compared to the efferent arteriole that's exiting it. So that's going to be important, as we'll talk about it in the physiology, in terms of generating the pressure to push materials out of the capillaries. So afferent arteriole, glomerular capillaries. These glomerular capillaries are surrounded by a layer of the glomerular capsule that is called the visceral layer of the glomerular capsule. So this yellow layer has been peeled off of the right side here, and what we're seeing here is the visceral layer of the glomerular capsule. Technically, this is the parietal layer of the glomerular capsule, and the visceral layer is right on the glomerular capillaries. So it's like when we were learning the heart and there was a visceral pericardium right on the heart, and then there was a parietal pericardium lining the cavity. We have a visceral layer of the glomerular capsule, also called the Bowman's capsule, and we have a parietal layer of the Bowman's capsule or glomerular capsule. Okay, so that's why we see those yellow structures. And that layer that's right on the surface of it, that visceral layer, is made up of individual starfish-shaped cells coming from the marine biologists. Starfish-shaped cells called podocytes with their foot-like structures that are wrapping the glomerular capillaries and helping to make that filtration membrane. A couple other things to see on the zoomed up section. After the renal corpuscle, what do we have draining it? The proximal convoluted tubule. So what we're seeing here is just the first section of the proximal convoluted tubule, like we saw over there. This right here is a small section of the distal convoluted tubule, because notice that the distal convoluted tubule comes right back through that neighborhood, right next to the renal corpuscle. And it's not an accident. It comes right back by because this is a checkpoint, it's a physiological checkpoint that is called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. Some people abbreviate that the JGA. You would need to be able to spell it out. But the juxtaglomerular, juxta means next to, glomerulus, this is the glomerulus, the juxtaglomerular apparatus is a checkpoint that checks on the pressure and the concentration of the filtrate. And with a checkpoint, we can then make adjustments as necessary to how much filtration is going on. So it is made up of, so this whole thing is the distal convoluted tubule, but notice these cells on this side of it are a bit bigger. And these cells on this side of the afferent arteriole are also, there's more layers to them and they're a bit bigger. So combined, these cells from the afferent arteriole and these cells from the distal convoluted tubule, those specialized cells make up the juxtaglomerular apparatus. If we were asking on lab practical, we would point to both of those because both of those are required to make the juxtaglomerular apparatus. These cells specifically are called the macula densa by themselves, and these cells over here are often, they have a specialized name as well. I don't know if we'll really get into the details of that. I don't think you have to learn that in terms of the lab practical. But these by themselves are called macula densa, and when we put them together, those cells collectively are called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. Okay, so those are all the models and structures, I believe, off the top of my head, for the urinary system. Hope that helps.